Welcome to the Mandela Rhodes Foundation podcast, under the auspices of our founding patron, Nelson Mandela's dream to build exceptional leadership capacity in Africa. We invite listeners to journey together with us as they hear intimate, behind-the-scenes stories that helped shape the journeys of remarkable African leaders and people on the rise. The Mandela Rhodes Foundation podcast is a platform for authentic and personal narratives of what it truly takes to rise to leadership with a uniquely African lens across a range of topics.
Rachel, it's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. I've been very much looking forward to this. Thank you so much for making time to be with us. And maybe just to kick off, how are you coming in as you join us in this space?
Oh, I'm so excited, Judy. You know, I was reflecting a few days ago, why is it that I always say yes to Judy and yes to MRF things, events, gatherings? And I was thinking to myself, you know, there's only a few spaces or a few people with whom you can have your most complete conversations. And for me, you are one of those people. And also the MRF has always been a space of really complete conversations where you can be okay with knowing and not knowing, be curious, be perplexed, be confused, and then be enlightened at the end of it all. So that space for me is truly a gift. And so I come so excited and also so expectant, because I always come away with these conversations the richer for them. So thank you for inviting me.
Beautiful. I love that. I think one of the interesting sort of starting points I'd like to bring for us is August in South Africa is Women's Month. And it's a month that is dedicated to really thinking about how we commemorate the courage, the leadership, and the resilience of women in South Africa and the role that they played in terms of thinking about freedom and equality. So I guess the question I have for you to sort of kick off our discussion is, how do you believe young women can cultivate the courage that is needed for them to really step into the leadership journey that they desire?
Oh, I love that. I've always thought that the thing with women is that we have a very ambivalent relationship with power. Which is to say, in the way we were socialized, I think we were convinced that it serves us better to be mild and meek and to serve and to quietly accept and be with the flow of whatever the process is. And there's value and quality in all of those things. Those things are also very beautiful things. But I don't know that we've ever been encouraged to have an appetite for power, to have a drive, to want to determine, not just to support and nurture, but to determine. And so sometimes there's a shame built around that ambition. Sometimes we don't know how to hold it within ourselves. And my sense is we build that courage by acknowledging that we too desire to be powerful. And, you know, for me, the definition of power that I found most compelling is a theologian, Paul Tillich, who said that power is the inherent or intrinsic drive that every being has to essentially self-actualize. And for me, that's a very healthy definition of power, right? Which is, I too, just like you, want to self-actualize in the world. I want to have momentum. I want to define. I want to drive. And I think the minute women acknowledge that within themselves, that desire, which we all have, comes out of shadow and it goes into light, which means it becomes potent. So it's for us to almost acknowledge the fullness of what it means to be human, which is that we all want power, we all desire power, and then to figure out what is my version of that in the world and how do I dispense that into the world in a way that allows me, to your point, to create what I feel I deserve in the world. And done from a good place, what I deserve is often what other people deserve too.
How has your identity as an African woman shaped you and the way in which you show up generally, but I think particularly on global platforms?
That is so interesting. I don't know that I ever actually thought of myself as a woman in my formative years. I knew, of course, I was a woman. There were things around me that said, you're a girl, right? You're not a boy, you're a girl. I remember specifically as a child, it's so interesting. There was a boy in my class who was bullying me. I'm not too sure why he was targeting me specifically. I actually think he had a crush on me. So I got fed up of this bullying and I thought, I'm going to go tell on him and I'm going to go tell on him at home, right? So I went to my stepfather and I said, this is boy in class who's bullying me. And my stepfather, bless his heart, it's one of the most memorable moments I have of him is he took us to school that day. And then he came to me to class and he told this boy, if you bully my daughter again, I will come for you. And I remember that was one of the moments where I sort of thought, I'm a girl being protected by a man against another man. And those were some of the moments in which I registered womanhood. But for the most part, I think that I always registered myself as a unique soul on the planet. And for me, I think that's what has propelled my journey, is not so much these identity clusters that we are given, even though I was sort of in the periphery aware of them. But what has been most powerful for me in the world and in engaging with the world has always been trying as much as possible to be good at listening to my soul. Like, what does my soul desire? What do I seem to be attracted to? Why am I attracted to it? Why do I desire it? And so when I've ended up on all of these different platforms in the world, it couldn't have been because I was a small town girl born in a random city called Gweri in Zimbabwe, right? That was not the thing that would have brought me to these spaces. The thing that would have brought me to these spaces was the courage of being connected to a soul purpose and just having a suspicion that I seem to be attracted to what is deeply meaningful to me in terms of transforming my continent, transforming my world. I was just always interested in that journey of better. And sometimes even the identities that seem to be disadvantaging identities actually sharpen in us this thing even more, right? So whether it's being a woman, a small town girl, whether it's being Black, whether it's being, whatever it is, I feel like these, when you see it differently, these things can be exactly what propel us to want to say, wait, I think I deserve more than this, and I'm going to go take it.
I mean, I often say similarly where I say, I see myself as I'm a spiritual being having a human experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it feels lonely sometimes to say that, but it's exactly that. And I think that's part of what I really inspires me about you, is because there's something about the courage to actually say, yes, I acknowledge that. Yes, I am a girl and my dad protected me against this bully and I come from a small town. I'm Black. I'm from Zimbabwe. It's almost an invitation to think about how do we acknowledge those boxes, but also who created those boxes. So what does courageous leadership look like for you when you think about people trying to embody that in workspaces? And of course, one could say women were not designed to be in those workspaces. What are some of your thoughts and what does the research and work you've done say to you about that?
Courage exists for me on two planes. The first is the ability to take the risk to be who we are. And that's the first piece of courage, which is to acknowledge that there is an entity that is Rachel, that is Judy, that came with a particular sacred contract onto this planet. And there's work that I came specifically to do. And so how do I be in relationship with the parts that are uniquely me? Whether it's my quirks, whether it's my unique strengths and gifts, my unique talents. And how do I, with courage, show up with those things, right? So it's first acknowledging that there's a uniqueness. There's a uniqueness that only when I acknowledge it can I be courageous in the world. If I don't acknowledge it, if I betray myself, I will find myself consistently at the mercy of other people. I will be looking into other people's eyes for validation instead of saying, actually, this is me. This is how I come. And how can I meet how you come? The second piece is then in outward acts in the world, which is that courage for me when it's just about going after something or, you know, the word we love to use these days, dismantling systems or fighting for a cause.
You're sounding like a Gen Z, yeah? And I thought we were millennials, bro. What's happening?
I'm about to debunk all of that. is that I find that while that kind of courage with lots of gusto has been interesting for me to watch, what I also acknowledge is that courage always has to coexist with love and reverence. And by that, I mean that if you're just courageous, you get very good in terms of outward acts at calling people out, for example, at pointing fingers.
Yeah. Cancel culture, right?
Right. At saying this system doesn't work because X, Y. So you get very good at naming what doesn't work. I find that when you have love alongside courage, you have a capacity to call people in, not call them out, which is to say, let me be a mirror. Let me show you what I am experiencing. And let me ask you how you are experiencing what I am experiencing. And does this make us more complete? Does this make us whole as human beings?
Amen.
Because to your point of truth telling, one of the most fundamental things I've come to understand is that there's individual truths and then there's truth. Individual truth, it serves whatever purpose I have in the world or what I understand about the world and how it should work. But truth with a capital T, serves all of us. And so if my courage destroys you, I question that courage. If my courage has no reverence for the person who's in front of me, even as I am naming where they may be falling short, then that courage is only going to work to create big fissures in the world. And so for me, courage in terms of outward acts, just in the way internal courage acknowledges self, external courage has reverence for others. You were calling Ubuntu earlier.
Yeah.
The two have to dance together.
Hitting at my heartstrings. So I'm curious then to hear a little bit more about some of the sort of theoretical frameworks that inform some of the things that we're talking about, you know? So obviously you are the founder and lead practitioner of Narachi Leadership. And I think what stands out for me about that is the values-based component, the courageous leadership component, where you try in your practice to say, how do you facilitate leadership development and coaching in a way that bridges quite an interdisciplinary sort of element?
Let me start at the beginning of how Narachi Leadership started. When I was at McKinsey, I remember once having one of my rants about how leadership development on the continent just wasn't empowering African leaders in a way that helped them deal with their unique trauma so that they could then emerge into their full power, right? So I had a big issue with that. But then I also had a big issue with how leadership development didn't seem to me democratized. So it seemed to me, and you would know this, we've worked and grown up in very elite institutions. They have the best when it comes to leadership development work. But I would come across, organizations, startups who had never heard of some of the frameworks and the models that we knew, they became sort of backhand knowledge for us, right? And I thought to myself, this doesn't feel to me like the way we heal this continent and the way we bring leaders into a depth of power that really allows them to achieve what they need to achieve. And I've always believed that a lot of the times leaders fail because A, they don't have tools, but B, they also don't know how to acknowledge that they don't know what they don't know because, ego. So
also Johari's window, right? Johari's window, like,
there
look,
you go,
guys,
blind spot.
you know this, other people know this about you, and it's frameworks, exactly, 100%, yeah, 100%,
exactly. So if people don't have those, how do you build self-awareness? And we know that self-awareness is 40% of the work. So if I don't know how to build the self-awareness in the first place, of course, I'm going to go to the frightened part of myself, to the frightened part of my psychology. I'll lead from that place.
Yeah.
So I remember having a big rant about this, and one of the partners in the firm said to me, and these are the people that come into your life to remind you, right? And he said to me, you complain about this so much. Why don't you just do something about it? You keep complaining about this thing, and clearly you see it in your own unique frame. So do something about it. And that was the seed for how Narachi Leadership started, because I thought to myself, yeah, be the change. As cliche as that sounds, if you are so compelled by it, it must be because it's part of your soul contract.
Beautiful. So publicly expressed views around the boy child, I think, in the context of thinking about organizations that want to create platforms where women can be, uplifted and we can sort of close that gender gap. I'd love to hear more about your views on what is the implications on the boy child.
Yeah. So some years ago, part of my work is working with young people, right? So we run a mentorship program as an example for 19 to 25-year-old emerging African leaders to give them the tools that older leaders tend to say to us, I wish I knew that when I was younger. So we said, okay, so let's give it to the young folk. One of the experiences I never forget is in one of my conversations, I was asking a young man who had just started university, so what are you interested in? What are you going to do as societies, activities? What are you joining? And he said to me, Rachel, I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking about, it was very flippant, like young boys, he was very flippant about it. He was like, look, he was being cool and whatever. And he says, I think I'm just going to give the chance to the women. And initially it seemed like he was, if you're not listening deeply, if you're not listening generously, it seemed like a flippant comment about, well, I'm a guy, I don't need to be doing very much. So I dug deeper and he said, Rachel, it feels very awkward being a young man in the world today, because if I am too ambitious and if I go take up, a role in some society on campus, I will get accused of taking space that a woman should be occupying. And so I'm struggling, he said. We had the conversation. It was probably like a 10 or 15-minute conversation. It ended. The vacation after that, I heard that he had committed suicide. And I have no idea, I cannot say with certainty why a person takes their own life, because I know what it's like. We know what it's like to have been women growing up in a man's world, right? It's a man's world. We know what that felt like, this sort of making yourself small and having to figure out how to make yourself bigger, or other people making you small. That's a pain we understand well. And I thought to myself, what must it have been like for him to be, as a practice, constricting yourself, making yourself smaller?
Yeah.
That moved me to think, surely there's a way in which we do both and. Surely there's a way in which we can acknowledge the wounds of the past, the injustices of the past, while not creating the injustices of the future. And my concern always with boys is that as we expand opportunities for women, we are doing it at the expense of boys. And it doesn't have to be that way. You can do both. You can empower both.
This actually leads me quite nicely to a question that I wanted to ask you about healing, because you've often spoken about healing as a leadership competency.
Yes.
How does healing at an individual, level, but also collectively, but maybe even beyond that at a generational level. Like, how does that healing play an important role to the journeys that we are asking people to step into when we say there must be leaders, right? Because when we look at the current state of the continent and the world, what is the role of healing in all of that, you know?
My radical thought about this has been that no one should be allowed near the presidency specifically if they haven't gone through some form of therapy. Because to load a person with power when they haven't gone through a healing journey just means that they're going to unleash control and fear and sometimes evil into the world. I remember reading the biography, one of the biographies written about Mugabe, our ex-president. And one of the things that stood out for me was how his father had left when he was a child, how he had struggled to integrate. So, for example, when they went to herd cattle, he would be reading a book. He wouldn't be interacting with friends, right?
Are you talking about Dinner with Mugabe?
There you go. Exactly. I think that was the book.
Yes, it was so good.
Right? And so you have this man who has probably a rejection and abandonment wound, probably a personality that is deeply introverted and doesn't quite always know. So all the tools, MBTI, Enneagram, right? All of the stuff is coming, all right? And so when some of the behavior started manifesting, for example, in the way that he was as a leader, I remember saying, this guy doesn't know how to play nicely with other children.
Yep.
And I also often get into trouble for this because I, more than judgment, tend to feel empathy for some of these leaders because I kind of go, who helped you? Who helped you understand that your childhood, your wounds are deeply impacting the way that you're showing up as a leader? And that in fact, there are things that can support you with this and can help you with this. But imagine a person who is, because of course, if you isolate yourself from people, you have a tendency to be suspicious of human beings. You don't know how to trust deeply. So of course, as a leader, anyone who says anything that mildly sounds like criticism is treasonous, must be jailed, must be killed. And it's like, no, actually, but that's the body keeping the score.
Yeah.
I imagine this man had a visceral reaction to rejection, a visceral embodied reaction to what feels like betrayal that stems probably from his father leaving. So we think, oh, well, it doesn't seem to mentally impact me because, look, I'm very powerful and I've got all these accolades. And in fact, I'm president of a whole country. But actually, you're leading through your wounds in an unhealthy pattern. And the impact on millions of people is huge. So for me, healing is it's not like an airy-fairy, esoteric, nice to have. It is absolutely fundamental because one woman I love, Elizabeth Fox, said it so beautifully. What we call weaknesses in corporates are often trauma. So the word we've nicely packaged is here are your weaknesses or your developmental areas. But a lot of the time they're reflecting the trauma that you haven't interrogated. And you and I know it both, Judy, because we are not exempt from it, right? We're not. We too have had to think, what does my healing look like? How do I not wound others because I am wounded?
Beautiful. I love that. And so I'm curious about what your views are on imposter syndrome and what causes it.
I have an interesting relationship with imposter syndrome. I don't buy into the theory of imposter syndrome. I'll tell you why.
Okay.
I think that there is nothing syndromatic. Is that even a word? I don't know. I think we've turned something that's actually a very normal human condition into a syndrome. And by that, I mean, it is as it should be that you will walk into certain rooms and feel like you are not adequate, you are not ready, you are perhaps under-equipped or whatever it is. I think for me, that is as it should be, because taken in its healthy form, that's humility. That's an acknowledgement of that, wait, there's something bigger than me happening here. And perhaps there's a bunch of things I need to learn. I do think that it's the hubris of our age that has now turned this into a syndrome. The superstar egoic tendency that we have taken on, that when I walk into the room, because I'm brilliant and bright, I must be immediately amazing. And I'm like, no, calm down, like go back a couple notches, right? You're going to walk into rooms, especially if you are taking risks in life, if you are, like we talked about earlier with power, if you are really following the intrinsic drive that you have to self-actualize, of course you're going to walk into rooms and be like, wait, how did I end up at Oxford? What am I doing here, right? Or how did I end up at Cambridge? Or how did I end up at NYU? Whatever it is. How did I end up here? And am I worthy of Cornell? It's not a syndrome. It's a human experience.
As much as we can both acknowledge imposter syndrome has been theorized, perhaps in a Western sense, like maybe over-theorized, what is the 1% that we can take from it, that is relevant and that we can sort of share? Because I think I look at my own life and I think about when I became CEO of the foundation. Initially, I didn't feel imposter because it was home and I was, I head up the program, and then I became deputy CEO, and I was like, yeah, I've been sort of equipped for this. But then as one sort of gets on, and then there's these external pressures, quote unquote, of like, well, you should be doing this or you should be doing that. And so how do you show up in those spaces? Like, I definitely found myself feeling anxious. So I don't know if it was about, I was feeling like I'm an imposter, but I felt an anxiety of, oof, I've never done this thing before, And I think my anxiety stroke imposter was fundraising. I've never done it before. Now I'm supposed to do it. And then actually, once I started to reflect with my coach, what is the anxiety about? It was, well, there's these targets and you must get this money by this date. And then but what is the process of fundraising? And once I started to relax into that, I was like, oh, but it's just relationships. It's talking to people about what we do, telling them this is what we do. And then learning to be okay with that and not feeling like you're inadequate because 9 out of 10 people said no, because you have to find that like 1%, So I do think it might be helpful for you to share what we might sort of name as imposter, but that anxiety that, oof, this is a big stage. Did you ever have those moments, And
of course. Yeah.
Can you think of a specific moment where you were just like, I don't know, I'm quitting, I'm leaving, I can't do this,
I can think of many, not just one, many. I just didn't think of it as imposter syndrome, right? The biggest, earliest example of this is when I went to Oxford, because at UCT, I was easily one of the top students in my class. I was easily very good at what I did. I got it. I understood it. I was cruising. And then I got to Oxford, and Oxford has a very different way of teaching, which to me doesn't feel like teaching at all. It just feels like a lecturer talking to you and telling you a bunch of stories and then saying, figure out what that means. It was a lot more reading than I had been ever taught to read. I'd never been taught to speed read as an example, because I didn't go to the kinds of schools that kind of gave you these worldly skills, right? I went to government schools my entire life. And so we were given the basics. Here's a book, here's the teacher, here's the knowledge, write the exam, pass it. There wasn't really also all of this other stuff about empowering you, for example, to think critically or to read fast, as an example. And so now you get to Oxford and you're being given all of these texts. You're told to go find them yourself in the library. You're told to read just an incredible amount of material. And so for the first time in my life, I think I got my assignment back and I had like 60-something%. Listen, 60-something% is what got me to Oxford, right? I went to Oxford because I remember one of my professors saying, I have never seen a person who gets such high marks in their assignments. Like it's mind-boggling to me. I remember she said that. I was like, oh, really? And then I get to Oxford and I'm like 61. I can't remember. It was like 62%. And I literally had a crisis. I was like, what is happening? And you know what was interesting is immediately I fell into, I'm going to be found out. People are going to figure out it was a mistake that they brought me here. But even more than that, what scared me even more than that was I was going to find weaknesses in myself I didn't even know I had. And that was the scarier piece, was I was now seeing myself very differently from how I understood myself in the 5 years that I'd been at UCT. And why I was saying for me, the term imposter syndrome becomes problematic is it sort of gives a blanket name to all sorts of maladies. I feel like it doesn't then allow us to say, like what you said, what is my anxiety? Because if I can focus on what the anxiety is, I've got a much better chance of figuring out how to overcome this moment than saying I've got imposter syndrome.
Exactly.
For me, it was the fact that I didn't know how to ask for help. That was the issue. It wasn't so much imposter syndrome, even though it was presenting in what you call imposter syndrome as feeling like I'm going to be found out, I'm less than, I'm not good enough. My bigger issue was I didn't know how to say, is there a reading center? Is there somewhere that can teach? Because I'm struggling to read these volumes of text you're giving me. Or actually, I don't understand the way the professors teach. This sort of figure it out yourself stuff is not what I'm used to. I'm used to being told what to learn, and then I learn it well. So it was my own ego, my own bravado, right? That actually stopped the process of learning for me.
So, I mean, you said for you, it was struggling to ask for help. So how did you go about asking for help? Or was that something that you struggled to do throughout your course? And if you weren't able to do it there, when did you finally get to a point where you could ask for help?
Yeah, I didn't ask for help. I struggled through Oxford. I struggled through it because I withdrew. And in fact, one of the things is I went into a lot of blame. It's the institution that doesn't understand how to teach Africans. It's the racist institution. I did a lot of that. I did a lot of externalization. But what I was really struggling with, like I said, is the vulnerability of saying, wow, okay, I'm challenged and I don't know how to deal with this challenge. I didn't learn that at Oxford. I learned that later on in life, where one of the things that helped me was encountering leaders who asked for help and watching them role model that vulnerability and seeing the power that was in it and going, oh, wow, you can actually do that. Because I hadn't seen that as yet. So for me, that was super helpful. I think it was also learning through the tools that we've been exposed to. And by the way, MRF was one of those places where I started to learn that. Understanding how to name things. Go into your body. What are you feeling? Where's the tension? What is the emotion? Name it. Because when you can name it, you can figure out, what do I do with it? So I started to be able to say, Rachel, you have a tendency to want to know everything. And so you struggle to then say in moments that you don't know, I don't know. And then you get into a lot of trouble. So for me, that practice of learning to name things and to name them out loud meant that resources increased for me, help increased for me. But I finally got that in vulnerability. I found that my experience changed.
Hey, if you don't name it and you don't say it, we don't know that it's real, right?
Absolutely.
So, having then been at Oxford, exposed to that global context, and then working for some very prestigious global institutions, you then made the decision to come back to Zimbabwe. And not coming back to Zimbabwe at a time where it was like, hey, look, the economy is blooming. This is the time to come back. We're going to create a new Wakanda. What led you to the decision to leave what a lot of people might view as a very prestigious opportunity working in a global context like that?
To be honest, at a very visceral level, Judy, it was guilt. I started to feel that I was using all of my energy and all of my talents and all of my best self on countries, companies, environments that would have been just fine without me. I was like, Yale doesn't need me like that, right? And consistently, because my big angst in the world was, how do we improve the state of leadership on the African continent? I started to ask myself, so why are you here then? Like, if that's your question, and if you hold true to that question, why are you here? So I started to allow the conviction to bother me. I'd always had the conviction. I just always, when you just keep pushing things aside and saying, okay, if I ignore it, if I go out and have a nice brunch in New Haven, I'll be fine. I'll have forgotten about it after the brunch. And then I started to pay attention. I started to say, the way in which our soul speaks to us is that it starts to sharpen conviction. You start to feel a kind of way about not living fully up to your potential. So for me, it was that I'd always been true to my gifts and my talents, but I'd taken the safe versions of them. And so it was primarily guilt. But then on top of that, it was also, I started to question, when we expect our countries to change, who are we expecting to change them? And that was a question I also never wanted to be bothered by.
Yay.
That's what then made me go, you know what? You know what your gift is. You know what your talent is. You know what your strength is. You also know that you come from a context that is burdened by leadership that could be better. So what is your contribution to that? Go back home. And so I quit my job at the time, which was at Yale. And I moved back to Zimbabwe to 18-hour power cuts at the time. It was a real like baptism of fire, if I were to call it that.
Yeah, but also maybe an embodiment of what we spoke about earlier in terms of, sort of courageous leadership, healing, So I'm curious then, once you made that decision, in the years since you've been back on the continent working on leadership development and coaching, what have you observed as some of the sort of leadership strengths and gaps that African leaders have?
Let me start with the gaps so that people can forget about the gaps, and then I'll move on to the strengths, because I'll make the strengths last. But and I'll tell it through a story. It was interesting. Some years ago, I was running a leadership workshop. And some of the people in the room, this was in Zimbabwe, and some of them were army generals. And if I remember well, it must have been a session perhaps on trust or something of that nature. And I'm saying that because of the reaction it solicited. And one of them came up to me privately and said, everything that you've said has shifted the way I see the world. And it's so powerful. I'm going to practice it with my family, but nowhere else. Because anywhere else, it would be dangerous to be this vulnerable.
Sure.
And I've never forgotten that, because I thought to myself, isn't that so interesting that there's this incredible, somebody recognizes what their higher humanity could look like, but then they also acknowledge that there's an entire system that exists around me that would absolutely make me fodder if I were to do what you're so beautifully illustrating is possible here. And that for me, I think, is one of the moments that represents for me what the biggest weakness of leadership is on our continent, is I think that we all acknowledge that there's something wrong, but we are often not willing to do what requires to make it right. So when people say, don't people see this? Don't they have a conscience? Of course they see this.
They see it.
It takes a great deal of courage to then say, I see it, and then I am going to role model in my environment what it means to transform myself so I can transform the space. And so whichever way you cut it, whatever topic you're thinking about, I think that remains one of the biggest weaknesses, is just embodying what it means to create transformation, which means sometimes stopping what you're doing. Stop it. Like, stop. It's not working. Stop it. Do something different. The strengths, which are many, the biggest of all, which always sounds cliche, is the resilience of the leaders on this continent, right? It always sounds cliche, but I think it's so important to just say our continent can be incredibly difficult. The resilience strikes me because I think it becomes the foundation through which a lot of other things become possible. I mean, sometimes in the most difficult of economic circumstances or or regulations. CEOs are keeping the lights on in factories and with no infrastructure, or in their corporate offices, and continue to employ people so that they can feed their families in some of the most difficult circumstances that you'll come across on this continent. So that resilience for me creates an interesting kind of innovation, an interesting kind of creativity, an interesting kind of problem solving. You see all of these strengths on a continent that I feel, I mean, some countries are doing very well to become super supportive, for example, of entrepreneurs, of corporates, making sure that organizations are as profitable and as productive as they can be. But we still have a way to go, right, to create that environment. And despite that, a lot of the times, despite that, I'm finding a lot of strength, sometimes just for survival, but even sometimes pushing to get to the thriving level of how do we actually solve our own problems. So I'm enjoying watching that. I'm enjoying a moment in which we are coming up with our own solutions. I'm enjoying watching new ideas, new businesses. And you just think to yourself, yeah, that's it. That's the brilliance of our people, right? Is people sort of figuring out under the most difficult circumstances how to make things work. The next level will be that we start to harness the wisdom of our local herbalists and healers to create our own medicines, right? That's for me would be the next level. That's what I want to see, is that we start to look for these ancient wisdoms that already exist and turn them into the solutions.
I love it. I definitely want you to share a little bit about, your perspectives about the current global shifts that are happening between the West and the rest of the world. Yeah, just sort of some of your views on that, but more specifically, what opportunities you see these shifts presenting in how African leaders show up, right? So it's sort of that two-pronged.
Yeah. So firstly, my sense is that nothing in the world happens by accident. And it's not the thing that is happening so much as it is the perspective and the opportunity that we see in it that matters. So, for example, with the aid question, I was reminded of Dambisa Moyo's work and the strong argument she had made about how aid gives an excuse for African governments to not do the work that they're supposed to be doing. And for me, while I saw the catastrophe in it, right, I remember watching one of the clips where a woman went to a clinic where she'd usually get some supplies. I can't remember what they were. She couldn't get them anymore because they'd cut aid overnight. Blah, blah. But the point is that I thought to myself, what an opportunity, right? Never put to waste a crisis, because this forces us to introspect and say, why are we so dependent on aid? What is this about? I see what is happening in the world as being as it should be. My sense is that it's a predicament. We're currently in a predicament moment, and the difference between a problem and a predicament is that a predicament requires that you really interrogate what are the values, what are the beliefs, what are the practices that have made us to come to be where we are today. We're not looking to solve technical problems here. We're looking to figure out what are the mindsets that create the world that we live in. So it feels to me, honestly, with all of the strife that is happening in the world, a powerful moment to reflect on how we have all co-created this. Let me give you an example. I would say a good 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, because of social media, whatever it is, we made it very cool to take sides. It became a really cool thing, for example, to say things like, did you hear that debate? Judy destroyed Rachel in the argument, right? She took her down. And we had such an appetite for these divisions. It literally became an addiction. And how fascinating it is that we didn't think that at a vibrational level, that would lead us to wars. Mm-hmm. How fascinating that we didn't see that. Because what we do at an individual level is what becomes the whole, right? And so when we made it cool for people to destroy each other, we created a climate, a culture in which destructiveness became attractive.
Yeah.
So for me, this moment isn't about what is this government doing? What is the Western world doing? What is Africa doing? It's a question of how are we co-creating the world we are all experiencing? Because that for me is the fundamental question. When I shift at an individual level, the entire system experiences that shift and then it has a ripple effect. And when we can learn that, I think is when we actually transform our world. But at the point at which we're still trying to say, let's have an intellectual analysis of why things are happening, we miss the point. We
Love it.
we all co-created the moment we're in now.
My last question as we wrap up is, how did the Mandela Rhodes Scholarship, and you were in the second cohort, so you were quite fresh in there. How do you feel the Mandela Rhodes Scholarship really equipped you in thinking about the journey that we've now shared around your understanding of leadership and courage, the decisions you've made, the perspectives you've undergone, and really, I think, very exemplary way of someone who lives what they say, which I find very inspiring.
Absolutely. Two things that come to mind for me. The first is when we wrote that essay for the Mandela Rhodes interview process, I remember reflecting on watching Sarafina. And that was the first time I learned about this leader called Nelson Mandela. But one of the things that struck me, I didn't write this in the essay, but one of the things that struck me is, what kind of a leader is this that makes people like make musicals about him and they dance on the stage? Sarah, I love Sarafina. And I thought, what a compelling human being you must be when people make whole musicals about you. And that for me was the lineage, it has always been the lineage of which I seek to be a part of. A human being who brings joy, who makes people dance, who because of the work that you do, people dance. That was always very compelling for me. But the second thing is a pivotal moment for me, and I've shared this many times actually when I've spoken, is when we had our first meeting, probably where you are sitting in that room, I think it was, if you're in the boardroom, right? Is Rejoice Ngongo, who was the program manager at the time, had us all hold candles. She had a candle and she lit it. And then she said, I'm going to pass this candle around the room. And if you feel that you can be the change that this continent needs, then light your candle. And I remember being so teary. It was so weird because I was like, is everybody crying? Is it just me, or is this so? Because it was the first time somebody gave me permission. It was the first time somebody said, it's you. It's you. You are in this room for a reason. You've been selected for a reason. There's a quality that we see in you. Now we need you to believe in that quality. And so MRF, for me, the Mandela Rhodes Foundation, was such a foundation of all of the qualities that I think make for a convicted leader. And it's not to say we do it perfectly. It's just to say it creates the soil in which it's possible to self-interrogate, to be deeply intentional, to be empathetic, to care, to want to create change in the world, to want to have courage and take risks. All of that I learned from all the courageous conversations, the activities, all of the things we were exposed to because of the Mandela Rhodes Foundation. And I remain so grateful to Madiba and the courage that he lived, to Sean and the space that he created, right? The environment that he co-created with his leadership team at the time. And then to people like yourself, Judy, who continue with the legacy, who step in and say, this is the work. This is the work, because it is the human beings that we carve that become the people that influence society. And if we create spaces in which we carve them well, at least the best of how we can carve them, then we have a better chance for a continent that actually works the way that we deserve for it to work. I'm so grateful. The Mandela Rhodes Foundation for me has such a special place in my heart.
Well, that is just the most perfect place to close our conversation. I feel like we could talk for hours because there's so many layers of things. But really, Rachel, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom, really your light and your courage. And I think, as I've said before, you're definitely a sister that I look up to. in the work, it's not easy. We are out there trying to talk about inner work, inner healing, vulnerability, courage, trust, integrity, respect, all of these things that seem so esoterical in a lot of ways, but knowing that there are people like you out there who are doing it, and that sense of community and space of openness really encourages me and the team in what we do. So thank you for such a soul-enriching conversation.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Mandela Rhodes Foundation podcast. To learn more about the Mandela Rhodes Foundation, visit our website at www.mandelaroads.org. Follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram for more updates. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your platform of choice to be notified of new episodes. This is a Volume Podcast production.